Hello, everyone. My name is LJ Stanbrook. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, and it's such a pleasure to have with us again Ambassador Ryan Crocker. I will use a name that everyone agrees with, a legend of our diplomatic service, a person who has served under many administrations and in many posts around the Middle East. Someone that I had the opportunity and good fortune to meet in Afghanistan, in Kabul in 2011, when he was the ambassador of the US to Afghanistan, and it's a great pleasure to have Ambassador Crocker with us again. He visited with the World Affairs Council twice in the preceding years, so it is always a great pleasure for us to have you with us. Let me start, if I may, just letting everyone know that World Affairs Council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We promote knowledge on global issues, on important global issues, and also discourse and deliberations of international issues. It is a very important part of our democracy to have informed citizenship, and we're very happy to be able to do that. Please do note that your microphone will be on mute and your camera turned off for the duration of this presentation. To submit a question at any time, please use the question and answer box in the Zoom toolbar. This presentation will be recorded and we will share with you through the WACC mailing list, so please make sure you're signed up to receive our emails. If you do enjoy today's free program, please consider making a financial gift to help support our work, or become a member, or please increase your membership, because these are difficult times. We don't have live programs. So if you would like to help World Affairs Council of Charlotte sustain itself, please do help us with your contribution. As I said, Ambassador Crocker is a diplomat in residence at Princeton University. He was a career Foreign Service officer who served 6 times as an American ambassador to Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon. 3 of these appointments were under Republican administrations and 3 under Democratic administrations. Ambassador Crocker received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian award, in 2009. Other recent awards include the inaugural Bancroft Award presented by the Naval Academy in 2016. Also, that year in 2016, Ambassador Crocker was named an honorary fellow of the Literary and Historical Society at University College Dublin, where he was presented the annual James Joyce Award. He has been named as the 2020 recipient of West Point's Thayer Award. He is an honorary Marine. So again, please, if you do have the ability, do help the World Affairs Council by becoming a World Affairs Council member, or donate to the World Affairs Council. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Ambassador Crocker. We try to minimize the moderator and maximize the speaker. So Ambassador Crocker, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, LJ, and it's a pleasure to be back with you in Charlotte, even though just virtually, the beginning of the future. Just before we went live, LJ and I were kind of talking about the coming tsunami of COVID-19, and reflecting that all of the good work that LJ has done over the years, and that all of you affiliated with the council have done over the years, kind of sets the stage for, or provides a framework for what will spool out in the coming years and beyond as consequences of the pandemic. Through your participation and the great programs he has brought, you will find you've got kind of a ground level framework for looking at the unknown that is rolling toward us right now. It just underscores again at an even higher level the incredibly important role that World Affairs Councils play in the ability of Americans to understand what our interests are abroad and why they are what they are. So again, I'm glad to be back. This is one of the premier councils in the country, and always happy to to be linked in by whatever means the circumstances dictate. So I'm going to try my own framework here to look at some of the conditions we face currently in the Middle East. As a serving foreign service officer, I always found history to be the most important discipline in my efforts to understand and make sense of what I was encountering overseas. We Americans do a lot of things well. One of them is not history. It's a pejorative in our country. That's history. Don't bother me with the day old. Give me what's now. But particularly in the Middle East, history determines your todays, and it predicts to a significant degree what your tomorrows might look like. So ignore it at your peril. And that's a preface for going back a little over 100 years. The Middle East, in its current form, basically a product of the Versailles Agreements that ended formally World War I. It was in anticipation of such an agreement that the British and the French got together in the middle of World War I to effectively carve up the Middle East between them. That was the Sykes-Picot Accord of 1916. Woodrow Wilson was very much present in Versailles with his famous 14 points that had a lot to do not only with, of course, democracy at home, but democracy abroad as a way of looking to a better future than the past. It didn't quite play out that way, of course. On the one hand, the British and the French had their own ideas for what the post-World War world should look like. They did not want us interfering, period. And then, of course, we had to deal with the rapid turn into isolationism that the 1918 by-elections brought in the United States. A solidly isolationist Senate that in no way would be prepared to approve our membership in Woodrow Wilson's brainchild, the League of Nations. So we were out. The Europeans were rolling forward as pretty much as business as usual. Let's carve up the world between us. Did nothing to restructure the global order that had brought us World War I in the first place. Basically, a balance of power system gone wrong, and could and did overbalance pretty quickly. So we were out, the Europeans were in, and the Middle Easterners were down, in the sense that they were no closer to self-governance post-World War I than they had been under all those centuries of Ottoman rule. The Ottoman Empire, of course, collapsed in World War I, where they had allied themselves with Germany. And 1919 Middle East Division was all about who got to rule them next. It wouldn't be themselves. Now, I give you all of this. Again, I think history is important in understanding what's going on now. And in particular, when you're dealing with a part of the world that is acutely aware of its history, or at least its version of its history. You go out unarmed into that arena, it may not go so well for you. So just again, that's kind of the bumper sticker, a takeoff on the function of NATO, established after the Second World War to keep, how was that? To keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. So these themes play out at different points in our modern history. What that meant in a World War I context is effectively it was not a peace agreement. It was a 20-year, 2-decade truce in one awful World War. Because boy, that's all it was, 1919 to 1939. As everybody, led by the Germans, rearmed, reassembled, recocked, and got back into it. World War II and its aftermath played out very differently. It was clear to FDR that, as it was to his vice president, the highly improbable Harry Truman, by the way, that the world had fundamentally changed, including our role in that world. We weren't going to be able to put Europe in our rearview mirror as we had done in 1919, as we were forced to do, both at home and abroad, to be frank about it. We were going to be engaged, and that engagement started before the end of the Second World War. We had the San Francisco conference that produced the United Nations. Subsequently, we sponsored the Bretton Woods talks. That would be Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where the gold standard was replaced effectively by the dollar standard, and that provided the architecture for the post-World War II global financial order. So what was clear even before the guns fell silent, first in Europe and then in Asia, is that the United States would lead whatever came in the aftermath of the Second World War. Turning to the Middle East specifically, it was just 2 months before the end of the war in Europe that Franklin Roosevelt flew out for a meeting on the deck of an American destroyer, the USS Quincy, in Great Bitter Lake, just outside the Suez Canal. What did he do aboard the USS Quincy? He met with Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. We had known going into the Second World War that Saudi Arabia possessed vast reserves of oil, and we certainly knew coming out of it that those reserves were going to be critical for the post-war modernization of not just us, but the globe. So what Roosevelt did was send a very visible signal. What does all of this mean? Well, it meant security for energy. We would provide the security, symbolism of a warship as the venue for a high-level summit couldn't have been clearer, and the Saudis would provide the energy. And how important was it? Roosevelt knew how very ill he was in February 1945, and indeed he died 2 months after that meeting. The rigors of that trip out there, nonetheless, important enough for him to do it, again, realizing he was very gravely ill indeed. So with 1945, we saw an emergence of the United States as a global leader in the Middle East, as well as elsewhere. In the Middle East, there was one thing, crucially, that didn't change terribly much from the aftermath of World War I, and that was the issue of governance. Again, we saw the British and the French carve up that map between them effectively. The Italians did get Libya. Makes you wonder what fourth prize was. That was gone. What had the mandatory powers done in those 2 decades? Well, precious little to set the stage for self-governance. There was no emphasis on developing institutions, a body of rule of law that would be respected. It was all about get as much as you can, as fast as you can, and then move on to something else. What emerged in the 30s, basically, outright occupation, not looking as palatable globally then as it had earlier, led in some cases to and this started before the 30s, but reached fruition later, basically the creation of indigenous governing structures, monarchies, in Iraq, in Egypt, in Libya. Saudi Arabia, of course, already had its, as did the other Gulf states. Not so much focused on governance either. Not there with a broad national mandate. There because, at least as seen by their people, installed by the colonial occupiers. These colonial structures became things of the past in their own right. The time of revolution in the 1950s, where we saw the British installed monarchy in Iraq brought down by an Iraqi military division commander, Abdul Karim Qasim. A few years before that, we saw the free officers overthrow the monarchy in Egypt. That led to the emergence, not right away, but within a couple of years, of Gamal Abdel Nasser as leader not only of Egypt, but at least making the effort to be a regional leader, if not an international one. So as monarchies receded, those at least used by or installed by the British and the French, you saw authoritarian regimes, military in the two cases I cite. How did they do in terms of good governance? Not so great. Again, the absence of institutionalization, the absence of a concerted effort to produce a climate of rule of law that would be more solid than any military dictator's grip. Military dictators were not interested in helping to bring that out at all. So it's something I call a failure of isms in the region. A failure of colonialism, a failure of colonially inspired monarchism, a failure, as we saw, of militarism or authoritarianism, depending on who was in uniform and who was not. But again, we did not see any effort toward the evolution of strong institutions that were stronger than any given individual. It was, again, leadership by personality, if you will. So if you then, move on forward, more isms to fail. The Palestinian nationalism, a failure, not just, and of course not at all, in the West Bank, Gaza at the time of its inception, but as a regional cause, that got a lot of salutes, and it failed as well. Communism was tried and abandoned in South Yemen, the only country in the region, incidentally, that ever had a communist government. What else? Baathism, Arab socialism, the two primary exponents of which were Iraq and Syria, and where it served as an ideology that divided rather than unified, as those two nations went to head a number of times. But what Baathism did not provide, again, was good governance. So now we're in an era of Islamism, let's say. What difference does that make? Well, I think we've already seen that Islamism failed to control territory over the longer term. In part, and again, we all remember 2014 when Islamic State erupted out of Egypt or out of Syria and just swept through Western Iraq and Northern Iraq in a matter of days. Given the weakness of the Iraqi establishment forces, not too much of a surprise, I suppose. They kind of got it, Islamic State, that there was this governance thing, and it had not gone well for its many predecessors over the decades. So they tried things like taking over NGO-run health clinics in Syria. They produced uniformed police with police cars, with sirens. They handed out parking tickets in Mosul. That's a different kind of approach, isn't it? It didn't play out for them, though. The combination of their own extremist ideology and the military pressure that we led against them really has sent them down the same road as predecessor governing structures in the region. Are they gone? Are they no longer a factor? No, of course not. If there's one thing I learned in Iraq in the 07-09 period when I was an ambassador, is that it was impossible, ultimately, with over 170,000 troops on the ground. We still could not eliminate completely Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was the predecessor of Islamic State. Why was that? Because there were Sunni communities up in the north, in some of the tougher neighborhoods in Mosul and on up the Euphrates River Valley area, where the Sunni population considered Islamic State less bad than the Shia-dominated regime in Baghdad. Again, questions of governance. So Islamic State is not gone. It will continue, I think, to create instability wherever it can. The Syrian civil war is not over, in which Islamic State is or was a dominant player. They're still there. Can they control territory? Can they govern? Not based on what we've seen so far. What does this mean? What did this mean? That against this backdrop of 100 years of failure to govern, with a few exceptions, obviously, like Israel, and its unique circumstances, what did it mean for everybody else? Well, we started to see, in consequence of the Arab Spring, not just the failure or overthrow of regimes, not just military coups. We started to see the collapse of entire states. That was the case, obviously, in Libya, in Syria, certainly in Yemen. Iraq, again, a different case, because we did the coup making and execution. And again, if you can see it there on the map, this does not go all the way west. The State Department considers North Africa to be part of the Middle East. The Department of Defense does not. And you see in that little example some of the coordination problems we have interagency. So again, Egypt goes down, or Syria goes down, Libya goes down, Yemen goes down, Iraq teeters, Afghanistan teeters, both again cases of US intervention and an attempt to remake a political order. Calling into question, again, not simply means of governance, but the viability of any entity capable of actually running the affairs of state. This was new territory for us after 2011. Does it mean the complete collapse of the state system as we know it in the Middle East? I think that's too soon to say. But here's what I would say. The pressures of COVID-19 are are immense and thus far, I think, not really measurable for us or for anyone. Not a lot of data coming in on the incidents in the Middle East of this pandemic, largely, I fear, because many of those countries do not have public health systems expansive enough or well-trained enough to accurately be able to monitor and measure the progression of this disease in their countries. If we look at, again, the impacts that we're starting to predict in our own country, such as, for example, what's going to happen to public schools in America? Big debate underway over these last couple of days. Without some massive federal intervention, many school districts effectively are going to be bankrupt. I don't think this is quite sunk in on all of us. Just as I don't think, for those who have remained employed, the stunning numbers of unemployed, and it's not going to be like the turn of a switch that COVID goes into a recession, one hopes, and bingo, everything magically comes back. It won't. How do we, as a developed state, as a world leader, how do we cope with these things? We don't know, and we're worried. So when you look at countries in an area such as the Middle East that do not have anything like our tradition of respect for rule of law, access to courts that are seen as independent, to sort things out, no good economic alternatives, and already a history of weak governance, what's going to happen out there next? Well, again, the short answer is we don't know. I certainly don't know. The broader question is going to be, how are we going to even attempt to measure the impact of this pandemic in the region and beyond, if they can't measure it? So I would simply say that everything I told you up to the pandemic, who knows where that leads? Because just as we had seen absolutely global situations arise in the First and Second World Wars, that's what this is. This is global. It is revolutionary. It is not, I think, ultimately controllable. And its secondary and tertiary impacts are yet to be felt, but they will be severe in the extreme. In a region that has already seen failing states, and we now see regimes trying with varying degrees of success, none of them very high, deal with the problem. All I can say is fasten your seatbelts. It is going to be one heck of a ride at home and particularly abroad, and particularly in the Middle East. So what I have not done in this is to talk about country specifics, like the new Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran, where Iran is going vis-a-vis its nuclear program. And a final point, and it will be my final point, what about the United States? We had started to back away from the global leadership role we had played since 1945. This did not begin, incidentally, with President Trump. It began in the Obama administration. That maybe the U.S. shouldn't be trying to run the world anymore. Well, maybe not. We never really had the conversation, not in President Obama's years, particularly his second term, and not really in the Trump years either. Setting aside the pandemic, I would suggest to you that what we have been looking at, and indeed the pandemic may typify this, if the U.S. doesn't lead, who does? So the fear for me, at least, is not that the Chinese are going to move in and usurp our global leadership role. It's that they cannot do it. There is no single country or imaginable coalition of countries that will be able to assume the leadership role of the U.S. should we decide we truly are not doing it anymore. And indeed, I think the pandemic is kind of a poster child for that. We certainly did not lead in international responses to the pandemic, and in many respects, we have done less well in our own society than many other countries have. So if we have the perfect storm here of the COVID pandemic and an American retreat from the world, what do we have? Well, I could just put that all to you, and whoever gets the most colorful, creative, or even plausible response to that question should get some fabulously good prize funded entirely by the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. So with that, I'm open to any thoughts, observations, critiques, or questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And Dr. David Calloway, board member, will be leading the question and answer part. David?
Ambassador, thanks for the inspiring and somewhat fearful look at the future. Always appreciate your in-depth historical and also just current relevant engagement in the space. We have one tactical question or a very specific question so far, but I just maybe wanted to dive in a little bit. You said you avoided some specific countries, but I am curious, as a physician who's dealing with global health security and COVID, I'm just curious to see or to hear a little bit of your thoughts on how this plays a role in countries like Iran, Pakistan, Iraq. Iraq and Syria. I think it's so chaotic it's hard to tell. But in these countries that had a bit of established bureaucracy, had a bit of system, and now are dealing with COVID, does that destabilize them? Does it make them a bigger threat? Does it make them a regional or a global threat, or does it make it so that they're so focused internally that perhaps they go offline for a little bit and become less of a destabilizing force?
Well, that is, I think, the ultimate question, and you structured it exactly right. These are countries that were having problems already. Certainly in Pakistan, where I served 3 years as ambassador, we kind of saw the consequences of a set of circumstances that had produced a very weakened civilian governance in Pakistan. It is instructive to compare, say, Pakistan and India, both, of course, emerging out of the British retreat post-World War II, both with similar systems that they inherited. The civilian side of the Indian government, I think, works passably well. It does not work in Pakistan. It did not work before the pandemic, and it certainly isn't going to be likely to work any better now that Pakistan deals with those consequences. What does that mean for a country of 185 million people with nuclear weapons and with a militarily dominated state? Again, fasten your seatbelts. If you think we have seen the worst, you have not spent enough time studying the Middle East. One of the really horrible nightmares would be a situation in Pakistan where instability grew to the point that they or we could no longer be confident that their nuclear weapons were secure. Now, again, I do not predict this. I throw it out as how can things get worse and what will the impact be on countries like Pakistan? I'll turn to Iran in a minute. Very, very grave indeed. In Iran, as you rightly point out, there is a history in Iran of governance that history, in at least its 20th century version, has a lot to do with Iranian policies and rhetoric today. The British had never formally colonized Iran, if you will, but after Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, then in the early 20th century, made the decision to move the British fleet from coal to diesel, it made Iran overwhelmingly important to them. And for the first half of that century, the 20th century, the United Kingdom was basically trying to run Iran as a mandate. From an Iranian perspective, and we were, after World War II, of course, we were right in there with them. When I'm doing my seminar on the U.S. and the Middle East, I spend an entire session on the 1953 coup of Mohammad Mossadegh, someone who the Brits really didn't like, and we were, as a nationalist who was talking about nationalizing oil in 1953, they wanted him out, and we were only too happy to help. Well, that's the gift that keeps on giving. You may have noted the Supreme Leader's comments after the death of Qasem Soleimani, talking about it's another 1953, meaning another external attempt to overthrow the Iranian regime. So they start with a high level of neuralgia there. The post-1979 development of governance in Iran is very interesting. It's nothing I've ever seen before. You really have parallel structures. You have and Iranians, like the foreign minister, will speak in these terms. You have the government headed by President Rouhani, and including what you expect to find under anybody's government. Civilian militaries, a military force, that all kind of looks like your standard wiring diagram for any state. But right next to it, you have what has come to be called the regime. And the regime is headed not by a president, but by the supreme leader. In this case, Ayatollah Khamenei. It's a parallel structure almost all the way up and down. It has its own military. The Revolutionary Guard Corps is not subject to the orders of the leaders of Iran's regular forces. It operates independently, and a subset of the Revolutionary Guards was, of course, the Quds Force, the Iranian operations division externally and also internally in some cases that Qasem Soleimani headed. So it's not the textbook government you want to keep your eye on now. It is the regime. And again, this is almost a unique case. Iranians certainly don't have full freedom of expression, nothing close to it, but more than you find in most countries in the area. And when they get really unhappy, they will take to the streets. They have. Not for reasons of high policy, but for reasons of day-to-day life. The economy's in the toilet. It was even before this. So, when you look at, you load the impact of COVID on this, I can't tell you what's going to happen, but I can tell you that for countries already facing internal challenges and pressures, instability, it's only going to get worse. And there will be somebody out there that is looking to find profitability, if you will, in a time of crisis. How may he or she move in to take over a weakening government, or at least a chunk of the country? So if anyone who was concerned about state breakdown in the Middle East before COVID, and remember, we had 4 or 5 cases of it, not of COVID, but of state breakdown. Well, the chances of more state breakdowns are extremely high. And I certainly hope the administration is thinking in those terms. What about Pakistan? Loose nukes, everybody's nightmare. Case in Iran. If they're not able to get on a track they like, they may go full scale for a nuclear weapon. It will take popular pressure off of them. Every citizenry out there seems to like having its own nuclear arsenal. That was certainly the case in Pakistan. So again, in this time ahead, don't be looking for possible intelligence failures. The failures that have hurt us so bad in the past are failures of imagination. This is the time for the current administration to be doing some very serious imagining of what could happen out there and how we would deal with it.
Thank you, sir. We have a bunch of great questions online now. There are kind of three buckets at the moment. One has to do with Turkey, one has to do with the role of diplomats, and the third has to do with leadership and recommendations. So I'm going to batch the first set of questions. In terms of Turkey, basically the question from Anonymous and from Chase Saunders and from from Abby Waters, in essence has to do with what do you suspect Erdogan's roles and next movements will be in terms of establishing dominance or control in the Middle East? Chase Saunders specifically asked, when will Turkish dams control the water flow in Iraq? And then Abby Waters has asked about some of the increasing lockdown recently and whether this has to do with a domestic response to COVID or other instability.
Yeah, again, great questions. A very important player in the Middle East as well as elsewhere. Turkey technically is not a Middle Eastern country. It's a European country, but it used to own virtually the entire Middle East as it was under the Ottoman Empire for all those, not just decades, but centuries. What I think we are seeing in Turkey is itself revolutionary. The Turkey that I knew for much of my life, and I had the privilege of spending the last 3 years in high school in Turkey. My father was posted to an airbase near Izmir on the coast, is figuring out what it is post World War I. And one of the things you've got to keep in mind, I think, as you look at complex international affairs anywhere, and nothing more complex than armed conflict, is the element of chance. In the case of the emergence of the modern Turkey, the events at Gallipoli, in which that ubiquitous First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, created the Gallipoli campaign, an absolutely suicidal effort to land at Gallipoli and basically cut off Ottoman forces from each other, ended in absolute disaster. Churchill was aware that it might, so rather than send real British soldiers in to do the fighting, they sent in the New Zealanders, the Australians, and the Indian Army, and that is still commemorated Anzac Day. It is not normally a celebration of British rule. Who won the victory and who was the Turkish commander on the Gallipoli Heights? Well, that was the man who came to be known as Ataturk. He never would have had the propulsion into the position he did to effectively become the first post-Ottoman leader of Turkey without that victory at Gallipoli. And it's a long sidebar, but the element of chance in world affairs cannot be underestimated. Kemalism, as it was called, was basically secular. It gave a prominent role to the military, but in a unique way. Turkey has seen a number of military coups, and each time, though, power is handed back to civilians. The Turkish military has shown a readiness to play a watchdog role and move when it feels that events are getting out of hand. It has shown no particular desire to actually run the country indefinitely. Again, it's almost a sui generis case study. So what now? where is the modern Turkey? Well, with Erdogan, who has been a hugely effective tactical political leader, is coming up a little short on the strategy side. Who are we and what do we want to do? And can we do it? He was the only civilian leader to break the military involvement in politics. In the process, I think he may have broken the military itself. They are decisively engaged in northern Syria right now, Idlib province, against a variety of challengers, and it isn't going brilliantly for them. So whatever the neo-Ottoman aspirations of Erdogan might be, his ability to actually bring them about is very much in question. And I fear a Turkey that is stumbling, that is trying to figure out its own way. And in my own view, it is the worst of times for the U.S. to be disengaged from Turkey. And incidentally, as you look at the Syrian civil war, it's worth noting Islamism versus Islamism. The Turks, of course, have been heavily engaged, so have the Saudis, but on opposite sides. And anywhere you have a Sunni element to a major Sunni element to a conflict in that region, you're starting to see the pro and anti-Muslim brother sentiments emerge. President Erdogan is associated with the Muslim Brothers. For Salafi Saudi Arabia, the guardian of the two holy mosques, the Muslim Brothers are anathema. So it is another complexity, whether one looks at Syria and Turkey, or whether one is looking through a broader aperture at the currents moving now politically in the region. And this is one of them. There is Sunni versus Shia, Saudi Arabia versus Iran, we know that. But there's also this conflict within Sunni Islamism between more or less Muslim brothers and the Salafis in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. Just keep in mind, as this all flows forward, that there are drivers there that we simply don't see, and this would be one of them. On the water question, water is so critical to the Middle East, everywhere. Our first major diplomatic engagement post-World War II had nothing to do with Arab-Israeli peace or Saudi stability or anything like that. It was about water. It was called the Johnston Plan, and it was an effort in the mid-50s by the U.S. to get agreement among Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Iraq, Jordan, on a fair and durable apportionment of water resources. It was that important. That was not successful, and no subsequent effort has been successful. So the allusion to the dam projects, that predates Erdogan. There are certain accepted international principles to determine the quality and quantity of water flow from sources that cross through multiple states. In this case, the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, rise in Turkey and then go through, in the case of Euphrates, through Syria and Iraq. Turkey has not been following those principles. So water flows have been diminishing and they've been increasingly polluted. Now, Iraq and Syria have been in no position to do anything about this. But it is an ongoing, almost existential concern. If we need any more existential concerns on the table, watch for this one. When things calm down, and they will eventually, you're going to see a resurgence, I think, of just exactly the concerns that the question indicates. And I have now forgotten the third part of that.
That's okay.
Want to move on to?
Yeah, we can move on. We've got a couple of other very good questions. The next two are batch from Richard Schneider and from Jane Zimmerman. What specific steps do you think that the U.S. needs to take in order to reestablish a global leadership role? And then more specifically, what would be 2 or 3 of your top priorities for a new administration in 2021? And how would you recommend approaching Congress in order to garner support?
Again, great cosmic questions about the U.S. role. Look, our leadership role globally and the Middle Eastern Division from 1945 until fairly recently, hasn't exactly been a narrative of unbroken success. I mean, we've got Vietnam, just for one extra regional example. That said, I think we need to take a cold, hard look at what U.S. retrenchment actually means. What we've seen it mean so far in the Middle East is that others step up and make their own decisions. At one level, that's a good thing. At another, maybe not so good. The case I'm thinking of in the not so good category would be Saudi Arabia again. They launched the Yemen war basically without consulting us. A few days before they kicked off their air campaign, they did contact our commander of Central Command down in Florida to say they were going to do it. That they were informing us. They were not asking us, and they were raising it because they needed some of our enablers, air-to-air refueling, intel platforms, and so forth. Well, for a diplomat of my generation, that was unthinkable, that the Saudis would kind of launch themselves into a regional war without even talking to us. And an indication, and this was under, of course, the Obama administration, I think an indication of the impact of a perceived U.S. disengagement was having on the region. Well, that's only multiplied under President Trump. I thought it was going to be different when he made his first visit as president, was to Saudi Arabia and then to Israel. I thought he might be putting together a coherent regional leadership strategy. As it turns out, no. But then what? So what should we do about it? Well, I had argued back in the day when under the Obama administration, when the refugee crisis was truly global, that the U.S. assert leadership, not take in all the refugees or anything like it, but to structure a broad process that we led, and which would take into account both the capacities and the concerns of many in Europe. We didn't do that. Why does it matter? Well, the Russians did it. They weaponized refugees. That was the campaign against the civilians in the city of Aleppo, among other places, really to fuel a refugee wave into Europe with the view toward weakening European cohesion. And it worked. A lot of the tensions within the European Union are stronger than they ever have been. The Germans, who under Angela Merkel, I think, tried to do the right thing, absorbing over 1 million refugees, now they're paying the price. And the Russians are kind of where they want to be, with a disunified Western Europe. COVID, in which internationally we are leading not at all. And there will be a price paid for that. If we don't do it, nobody else can. So where would I start? I would look for international crises. There's always a bunch of them out there. And the biggest ones don't have a military aspect to them necessarily. It's, I don't know. I don't know where COVID's going, but in addition to getting it better than we've gotten it so far in our own country, I would hope that we are looking toward a set of circumstances that might lead us to taking more of a global role on this. I'm not holding my breath. And first, we do have to get it right here at home. But this may be the most severe crisis globally to international peace and stability since, say, the rise of the Nazis.
Thanks, Aaron. We have just a little bit of time, so I thought maybe I'd throw you a softball question. Can't pick up my sarcasm online. We have 2 questions from Rahul Sumantan from Vicky Sutton. And I think are relevant because we probably have some former ambassadors on the line, and then you have other people who still hold tight to the dream of one day becoming a diplomat. So the question broadly centers around your opinion on political appointees versus career diplomats, but I would extend it more to say, how do you strike a balance between career and political appointees and diplomat and the ambassador appointments? But then also, how do you make that combination stronger? So what mechanisms can help political appointees become better at their job, and likewise help some of the career diplomats become better as well? And that'll be our last sort of series of questions. Thanks, sir.
No, it's a great question. We have a unique diplomatic service in one respect. Certainly there is no other major power that has this hybrid structure of career officers becoming ambassadors and then political appointees. A lot of foreign service officers would like to see this go away completely. Well, that ain't going to happen. It's been there since the dawn of the Republic, and even before. A guy named Benjamin Franklin in Paris kind of kicked it off on the non-career side. But he could do anything, and so he did that. We've gone up and down on this over the years. The percentage had settled at about a third, career or non-career versus career. The quality of non-career ambassadors, I've seen it improve over the years, and I think this is a function of our unique process of Senate confirmation. If the White House sends over a completely unqualified individual, whoever the party is, even if it's the majority in the Senate, that will, if it's, will highlight the shortcomings, shall we say, of non-career ambassadors. Not a pleasant process for any White House, and it tended to make the selection process quite a bit better. We got some pretty strong non-career ambassadors out of it. I'm from Washington State. Tom Foley was seen as a pretty good ambassador after his congressional days, and there are many others of just top flight. It's a little out of control right now. I think we're topping 40% as non-career appointees. Congress is obviously distracted with a whole range of things. Power politics with a Republican majority have, of course, given the Republican-controlled Senate a lot of running room on these appointments for confirmations, and the Democrats have not been totally well organized in attempting to block at least the egregiously unqualified. So I don't see the whole system changing here. I would like to see us get back to a more reasonable percentage and better quality control, and I think that's quite doable. This wasn't part of the question, but I'm going to put this in here anyway, just very briefly. The so-called militarization of U.S. foreign policy. Not exactly from my perspective, and I've served in a few places where the U.S. military presence is quite strong. It is not a case, in my experience at all, that senior military commanders want to run policy or dictate it. It's the opposite. They often feel they are put in positions where they have to because nobody else is doing it, and they've got forces on the ground. But consistently over time at every level, I have seen a military leadership that is more than happy to be engaged with embassies, with high-ranking state officials in Washington, career and non-career. They will do this when they have to. They would much rather be in a position where they are working collaboratively in support of policies that are articulated and implemented by people whose job it is to work in the international affairs arena. So I'd like to hear us all stop complaining about militarization of policy and realize that with our military more deployed than ever in a post-Cold War era, the real challenge here is for collectively the government to get it right. And that really means, as most military officers will tell you, that means civilian leadership, and in particular, overseas civilian diplomatic leadership. So those of you with children and grandchildren, and you would like to see them have career options that don't involve the permanent occupation of your basement, tell them to go sign up for the Foreign Service exam. That's the first step. It can take you down some roads that are strange and wondrous. It certainly did for me.
Thank you, sir. Very much appreciate it. And thank you again for sharing your time with us this afternoon. LJ, I'll turn it back over to you, sir.
Thank you so very, very much, Ambassador Crocker. Ambassador Crocker is a career diplomat to Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon. And it is always a pleasure. As you see, there are many questions. We could have had a 2-hour session, and I'm sure we would not have finished. I do want to share with you that Ken First, who was with us in the delegation of the World Affairs Council of America in Kabul, is online today participating, and he says hello. And we have other people from around the country from the World Affairs Council system, and I welcome you here and thank you for participating. Board members of the World Affairs Council, thank you for participating and for your leadership. Dr. David Calloway, I know you're so very busy being on the front line of COVID-19 defense in the city of Charlotte and the region. Thank you for finding time to be with us. I would so much like to invite Ambassador Crocker to come again to Charlotte once the conditions allow. And let me just finish by sharing with everyone here today that we have on Thursday, May 26th at 4 p.m., the World Affairs Council Distinguished Speaker Series with Anna Fiefeld. She is the Beijing Bureau Chief at the Washington Post. She's talking on the great successor, the divinely perfect destiny of brilliant comrade Kim Jong-un. And then next week, we have another legend in the U.S. diplomatic service. We have an event on Thursday, June the 4th at 2 p.m. with Ambassador Thomas Pickering. So please join us. Thank you very much, Ambassador Crocker. The invitation stands. Thank you all for participating. We're adjourned. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, LJ.